Battlefield Z. Gone Dark. A Battlefield Z Legends. By Chris Lowry. Copyright 2018. Grand Ozarks Media. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. It wasn't easy being popular. Not that she would know. Emma Dillon walked with an understated grace across the quad, sticking to the fringe of the grass to avoid the popular boys. She could see a group of them tormenting one boy in the middle of the courtyard. They had separated him from his group of Boy Scout friends, much like lions separated the weak gazelle from a herd. Maybe they picked him out because of the yellow scarf, or because he had a curly mane of hair under a blue trucker cap with a yellow bill, familiar Scout colors. They could have chosen to terrorize him for his weight, which some would call husky, and others would say chubby. No matter the reason, they had circled around him, and Emma wished she could intervene. She wished she was popular enough to stop them. Strong enough to stand up to them. "Screw you, asswipe," the picked-on boy snapped as one of the lacrosse players swiped at his bandana. Emma wanted to call it a neckerchief, but she was sure the scout would argue the fine point with her. "Knob, be reasonable," said the tallest of the boys in the group, Steve Newton. "And I'm telling you to fuck off, quarterback punk," Bob shot back. The group oohed and made small noises among each other at the sheer nerve of the nerd. Emma spied the rest of the herd watching from the other side of the quad and swore they were cowering. Steve glanced around at the gang of boys. The jocks watched him for a reaction, and the rest of the kids stood frozen, barely breathing for fear of attracting unwanted attention. "Stop," Emma stalked up and yanked the neckerchief from the lacrosse player. "Just stop." "Get out of here, Dillon," Steve smirked. "Don't you have a story to write? About me? About the game? Did you play?" she asked even though she knew the answer. As far as quarterback punks went, Steve Newton hit all the checked boxes. The problem was he knew it. Some guys had confidence in their abilities. Steve had his, plus extra, probably stolen from all the kids he bullied for their lunch money. Stole their confidence too and stuffed it in his back pocket. "You saw me," the smirk got bigger. He leaned in closer. "I saw you taking my pictures on the sideline." "Stop," she said again and blushed when her voice cracked. She had taken his picture for the paper, and she did have to write a story about the game. But he didn't have to know she took more than one. Okay, a lot. Besides, he'd be way cuter if he wasn't such a butt cheese, Bob shouted and shoved Steve away from her. He screamed a short high-pitched yell, yanked the bandana from Emma's hand and took off running through his small group of scouts. "Oh knob," Steve called after him, laughing. "I'll talk to you later, Dillon." Emma hated that he winked at her. Hated that her cheeks felt flush and hated even more that she thought he was cute. Bob had it right, she thought as she watched him jog after the fleeing boy. He was a butt cheese. Whatever that was. The final bell rang and she rushed with the rest of the students toward her class. Chapter 2. The lights flickered in the editing room then went out. Emma bit back a small scream. Sure, she was alone in a big building all by herself, but Mr. Matthews was just down the hall in the teacher's lounge. She was about to call out for him when the emergency lighting kicked in. Yellow cones of weak light illuminated the doorway, along with a red exit sign over the frame. "Emergency lighting," she groaned. The computer in front of her stayed dark. Which meant all of the work since the autosave function was lost. "Damn," she grunted. "Damn. Damn." She closed her notebook and jammed it into her backpack. Whatever was lost would have to be redone in the morning, because she wasn't planning on staying here till midnight. Or later. Besides, her parents would be worried. "Mr. Matthews?" She called down the hall as she opened the door. Emergency lights bathed the linoleum in yellow washes of color, giving everything a sick look. Like a horror movie, she shivered. "Mr. Matthews." It wasn't like the teacher not to answer. Maybe he was outside sneaking a breath of fresh air. Emma trailed a finger along the metal lockers as she walked toward the exit at the far end of the hall. The school was quiet, a creepy sensation to her. She was used to the shouts, banters and just noise of 100 teenagers commingling between classes, bitching about homework or asking questions about pop quizzes. The noise filled the hall, bounced off the walls and made the day-to-day of school life just plain loud. Now, there was nothing. No noise at all. Not even the hum of electrical systems or air conditioning. Even the battery-operated emergency lights were quiet, the efficient LED bulbs a silent alternative to their incandescent ancestors. "Mr. Matthews?" She tried one more time. But her teacher was as silent as the halls. She opened the door to the outside and heard a siren in the distance. "At least I haven't gone deaf," she said as she crossed the empty quad to the parking lot. She was glad she parked close because the streetlights were out. She wasn't scared. There was nothing to be scared of, she thought. But she ran anyway, fumbled her keys out of her pack and jumbled them into the lock. Emma dropped into the seat behind the steering wheel, slammed her hand against the locks and sat there, trying to catch her breath. It wasn't reasonable, she said to herself. No reason to be scared. Just a blackout. Just a power outage. She had been through plenty before. 2 years ago, a snowstorm hit and the ice on the power lines took out the electricity for 4 days. No power then. Then why was the hair on the back of her neck standing up and why was she so scared now, she wondered. She cranked up the car and dropped it in gear. The headlights were a welcome relief across the dark expanse of the school. She turned the wheel as she pulled out and saw a shadow on the ground next to a door. It looked like a body. Emma rolled the window down halfway. "Mr. Matthews?" she called. But it didn't move. Whatever it was. Just garbage, she thought. A jacket left by some jock on the ground. Just a mistake, a trick of her eyes. She shook her head and didn't back up for a second look. She rolled up the window and drove away. Chapter 3. The road was blocked. A lone cop sat in the front seat of his patrol, black and white. The lights from Emma's car washed over his pale face. He climbed out, reached back in and lifted a short-barreled shotgun from the seat and racked it while she watched. He held up a hand to stop her. Emma rolled to a grinding halt short of the orange and white striped barricade and stared from the cop to the dark streets behind her. There were no streetlights as far as she could see. Just a pumpkin-colored glow from 3 buildings burning in their tiny downtown area. A lady is attacking a man back there. She rolled her window halfway down and yelled through it. "Where are the fire trucks?" "You need to go home and stay inside," the cop licked his lips. "It's not safe out here." Emma gulped as she stared at the road past him. "What's happening?" "Just go home, kid. Now." Emma sighed and cranked the wheel on her car. She popped it in reverse and pulled back into the dark street. When she was a few dozen yards from the barricade, she curled the tires to one side to turn around, and only had to stop and reverse once to straighten it out. She watched the lights in the far distance wink out block by block, chasing the dark streetlights until there was nothing to see but the cones of her headlights. It was almost beautiful. If she hadn't been so spooked. And alone, she thought. It wouldn't seem so bad if she wasn't alone. A car slid around the corner of a side street behind her, headlights bouncing as it careened off the curb and raced toward her. She clenched her shoulders, gripped the wheel and braced for impact. The engine roared as the car slipped around her, scraping her door and fender. "Hey!" she squealed. The car hit the next intersection and wavered. The front end slid one way, the back end the other, and the car plowed into the corner of a building. Bricks crashed across the hood in a cascade of dust and steam. Emma slowed her car to a crawl. She could see people now, running up the street and crossing the intersection. The driver's door opened and a lady in a bathrobe flinched out. Her chest and chin were covered in blood and she stumbled across the sidewalk, tripping on crushed brick. One of the first men reached her, tried to help her stand and balance. "Lady. Are you okay?" Emma heard him shout. The robe flared out like broken wings as the woman lunged toward him with a moan. Her would-be rescuer screamed as she latched onto his arms and yanked him off balance, her teeth chomping and biting his neck. They fell in a writhing heap. The rest of the people, more shadows than faces, kept running past them. No one stopped to help. Emma fought back a gag as the woman lifted her head, stretching skin from the man's cheek like rubber until snapped off in a shredded gobbet. He bellowed in rage and agony as he tried to push her off, his feet beating helplessly against the dark sidewalk. The other 2 men froze as they tried to decide what to do to help. A child slipped from the open car door and wrapped her arms around the shorter one closest to the car. He twisted around, tried to dislodge her. His feet got twisted in hers, twined like stiff vines, and they pitched forward across the other woman and the man on the ground. He added his screams to the other as the little girl ripped into his exposed flesh. The third man turned and ran. He sprinted toward Emma's car, pounded on the hood to make her stop. She slammed on the brakes and tried to breath. He glared through the window in panicked rage, and whipped around toward her door. She spun to lock it with her hand, but he cracked the handle as she slammed the lock. The door ripped open. "No!" she screamed. He yanked her out of the driver's seat, fighting with the belt to get her loose. The strap cinched around her neck, as her tiny hands beat against his arm. He pulled once, twice. Blue stars flashed in front of her eyes. She could feel the blood pounding in her ears. He flipped open a lock blade knife. Emma couldn't draw a breath to scream. The man sliced the webbing, dragged her out of her car and flung her to the asphalt. She gasped and sobbed as jumped behind the wheel and peeled out in a cloud of smoke and rubber. The tail lights of her car grew dim as he raced away, leaving her in the street. The fleeing driver blew through a stop sign. A car roared into the intersection and plowed into the side of her car. Emma screamed in disbelief as her car twirled around in a shrieking cloud of oily smoke. The rear end hit the curb and popped both tires. The driver of her car limped out of the wreckage. "Hey," Emma yelled as she stood up. "That's my car." The man held his head as he turned toward her. "Was my car," she muttered. A second car never slowed as it plowed through the intersection. Her car thief flipped ass over tea kettle and smashed to the ground neck first. She could hear it snap over the sound of the receding car that never slowed. Emma stared in open-mouthed horror. A moan caught her attention. She whipped around. A small group of people shuffled up the street toward her. They were sheathed in blood and viscera, dead lifeless eyes trained on her. She opened her mouth to scream but changed her mind and ran instead. Chapter 4. Where do you think you're going? She knew most of the people in town but didn't recognize these guys. There were 5 of them. Bunched together in a loose formation that stretched across the street, a few feet between each of them. Except on the left. Emma thought that guy looked twitchy. Looked scared. He was cheated in closer to his buddy, which left a gap between him and the lot beside him. "Don't you have bigger things to worry about?" She jammed her thumb over her shoulder to the conflagration on the street behind her. They couldn't see whatever it was chasing her. If it could even be called a chase. A group of people moving that slow. Relentless. "It's the end of the world, babe," said one of the men. He had a beard, dark eyes and a camo vest. It looked like it was stained with chocolate, and Emma realized less than a second later that blood dried like that on fabric. She faked to the right, then sprinted left, toward the open gap on the side of the road. "Grab her!" the bearded man in camo yelled. The young guy on the left darted for her, arms outstretched. Emma ducked under, slipped past and twisted as he made a desperate grab for her coat. He snagged it, drew her up short. Her feet slid on the concrete. She dropped out of the coat, gained her footing and sprinted even harder. She could hear them pounding after her, grunting as they ran. Emma reached the end of the block, turned left and put a building between them. Not much. Not near fast enough. But there was a park on the right just ahead, one of those reclaimed downtown lots turned into a green space to give people a place to eat lunch in nature. It wasn't much more than a fountain, and a walking path, benches and flowers that ran for the rest of the city block. And it was wide open. She thought she could dodge through the trees, put something, anything between them and her. Emma cut across the road, the footsteps behind her growing louder. Then she was in the park, her feet on the grass and she couldn't hear them anymore. Until something plowed into her back and tackled her. She slid across the ground, a heavy body on top of her. She couldn't catch her breath. Rough hands rolled her over, jerked her up. "Did you think you'd get away?" The beard breathed on her. Emma balled up her fist and socked him across the chin. His mouth was open and she heard it clack against his tongue. He squealed and stepped back. Emma drew back her foot and kicked him in the groin. Or tried to. He turned to the side at the last second and took the kick across his thigh. Then he clocked her with a backhand, hard enough to knock her out of the hands of the man holding her. She rolled over on the ground and tried to get up, but the man with the beard pushed her down with his boot and held her there. This could have gone easy. He spit blood into the earth next to her. "Hey butt cheese," Emma heard the words but they didn't quite make sense. She looked up through a sheet of her bangs that obscured one eye. There was a man with a lacrosse stick who took a swing at the shoulder of the guy standing over her. She heard the meaty thwack of it, the solid thud of polished oak slugger pounding into flesh. Not the crack of a leather ball bouncing off the stick, but a sicker sound. And instead of the roar of a crowd cheering one headed into the net, there was a scream of pain and rage. The man over her stumbled away, right arm dangling limp next to his side. "You broke my arm, you son of a bitch." A shadow-drenched figure danced into her vision, the menacing stick swinging lower in an arc. Her captor dodged back. Former captor now, she amended, and giggled as he hobbled away. Grief, and anger and fear washed through her, and she couldn't control the shivers as the others joined him, cowering away to disappear into the darkness. Then the shadow kneeled in front of her. "Are you okay?" Emma brushed her mop of hair back from her eye and stared up at Steve. Long hair slicked back under a ball cap, his almost permanent grin absent under a concerned scowl. He held out his hand and helped her to her feet. "Thanks," she stammered, and didn't like it when he shrugged it off. She meant it, damn it, and he was acting like it was nothing. Like saving her from what those men planned to do was nothing. An everyday act of heroism and superhero rye, if that was even a word. She shook the cobwebs out of her head and tried to blink away the confusion. The punch must have hurt her more than she realized. "He got you good, didn't he?" Steve hissed in between his teeth as his tender fingers gently probed the sore spot on the side of her head. "I need to get home," she muttered. Yeah, of course," said Steve. He took her arm and put it through his left one, right hand free to keep swinging the bat if needed. "We should keep moving." He pulled her along in his wake, not really waiting for her to agree. For her to say yes and follow along. He just assumed she would, and she did. Holding on to the crook of his elbow as he led her across the park. She wasn't out of it to notice it wasn't toward her house though. "I live that way," she tugged. "That's the way those guys ran," he said, and steered her back on course. "They may be waiting." She glanced back over her shoulder, and indeed, she saw shadows moving in the trees. People hobbled toward them. Just a couple that she noticed, moving like the man Steve had injured. Like they were hurt too. But it didn't look natural. She shook her head again. The fog of confusion was still there. She blamed the carjacking, the mugging, and the power outage. The crazy woman in the street attacking the man. It was all a lot to take in, and her head hurt on top of it. A pounding thrum exactly where the guy punched her. A pulsing in the skull, and after a second she realized it was in time to her heartbeat. "Hang on," she said, and pulled her hand free. She put her palms on her knees, leaned over, and threw up. "Gross." Steve stepped back so he wouldn't get it on his shoes. "What did you eat?" She felt her cheeks color even as her stomach clenched again, and she spewed bile and chunks onto the flower beds that separated the sidewalk from the grass. She stood up and wiped the back of her hand across her mouth and prayed for a breath mint. Steve swung a small pack around and fished out a bottle of water. He screwed off the top and held it out to her. "I don't drink from plastic bottles," she grunted. "Bad for the environment. Bad for the body." He shook it at her. "I think you've got other things to worry about." She thought about it for a second. He was right, she guessed. Besides, she wanted to get the taste out of her mouth. Emma grabbed the proffered bottle and took a small sip. She swished it around and spit it into the grass, then took another big swallow. "I can feel the microparticles in my system," she said. But she kept the bottle and drank again. "You can start a petition when this is all over," said Steve as he glanced around. "If anyone gives a damn about bottles, then." "They should," she said as a moan sounded in the trees behind them. He took her arm and led her across the street and up the sidewalk. She led him. "There is a floating patch of garbage in the Pacific Ocean the size of Texas," she said as they marched. "I wish we were there now," Steve answered. She noticed he kept the bat ready and felt the tension in his body as he walked next to her. Shoulders tight. Vein in his neck pulsing. His head was constantly moving, watching where they were going, watching behind them, and she realized he was scared. Which scared her too. They reached an intersection and he looked carefully before leading her across. 2 police cars formed a roadblock across the street behind orange and white striped sawhorses that stretched from sidewalk to sidewalk. "It's abandoned, or perhaps the officers who remained were dead." A third car was crunched between the noses of the cruisers, as if it tried to ram a way through and stuck there. The driver's side door was still open. Steve peeked in. "Empty," he announced. "Is that a good or bad thing?" "I say no police is a good thing," he glanced around. "Under normal circumstances." "Do these seem like normal circumstances?" she asked, her voice going shrill. Steve shook his head. "Anything but," he said. "Come on, let's keep moving." "I just want to go home," she said. "Can't you steal a car or something?" Steve stopped and stared at her a moment. "Is that what you think of me?" That I'm the type of guy who knows how to steal a car? Look, she pointed at the cop cruiser. The door is open. Just start it up. I am not stealing a cop car. Do you know how much trouble we could get in? I thought you were a badass, Steve, she said. You strut around school like you're the Class A king of crime. What am I supposed to think? Steve couldn't meet her red-rimmed eyes and dropped his gaze to study the ground. We're wasting time, he said. Emma glared at the dark streets around them. Lights flickered in homes in the distance, and the ever-present wail of alarms carried through the silent night. Go, she ordered. I'll follow. He took a few steps, then glanced over his shoulder to make sure she followed. After a brief hesitation, she did. Steve led them along the brick wall of a building and peeked around a corner. Clear, he said. They moved on to the next street and made it halfway down the block before a group of 7 shadows detached from the alleyway and began to move in on them. Who's there? Steve froze. Emma grabbed him by the back of the jacket like a drowning person seizing a raft. Are they dead? Chapter 5. Do we look fucking dead? A curly-haired boy flicked on a flashlight and shined it in his face. Bob! Emma shrieked. She ran to him, control lost for the moment, and wrapped him in an enormous hug. The hug was so strong, it spun them around so he was facing the 6 other boys with him. They were dressed in scout uniforms, armed with baseball bats and crowbars, which they held in lifeless hands as they stared in wonder at their leader in the embrace of a woman. I know. Bob mouthed over her shoulder to them. Told you. She let him go and pointed. It's them. Bob turned around and noticed Steve. Yeah, him. Asshat. We're out of time, Knob. Blow me, pretty boy, said Bob. You don't have your boys here to back you up. I don't need my boys to end you, Knob. We're going to help you, said Bob as he shifted his gaze to Emma. I already have a bodyguard. He won't leave me alone either. Bob watched Steve from the corner of his eye, as if he expected his nemesis to make a swipe for his underpants and yank them up over his shoulder blades at any moment. You can do better than him. Shut up, Knob. It's Bob, you zygote. I think you can use my real name at the end of the world. What did you call me? Emma moved between them, but only in passing as she kept walking away from them down the street. They stared after her for a moment, then Steve pounced into motion to fall in step behind her. Bob waved his scouts to join him a half-second later so that the line of teens stretched behind her as they hurried down the street. Shouldn't we focus on the zombies, she muttered as she stalked along. Instead of this asinine dick measuring. Besides, I'm not some old lady. I don't need help crossing the street. She reached the intersection and almost stepped off the sidewalk. Steve lunged forward, grabbed her by the back of the shirt and yanked her back just as a speeding car plowed through the spot where she would have stepped. The racing metal hunk kept going, straight into a building with a resounding crunch. An explosion of glass and metal rained down on the asphalt around them. Bob rushed forward and grabbed her by the hand. Are you okay? Emma brushed shattered glass out of her hair and off her shoulders. Yeah, I think so. Bob put her hand in the crook of his elbow. Here, let me help you. He took a step off the curb. Emma, still shaken, allowed herself to be dragged along with him. Hey, I should do that, Steve called after them. Why? Bob snapped. I'm the one who saved her life, Steve hurried after them. I just want to get home, said Emma as they made it across the intersection and huddled on the corner of the street. In one direction they could see a fire flickering a few blocks away from another car set afire. The streetlights were gone in the other direction, a tunnel of darkness leading off into the distance. Which way? Steve whispered, as if he was afraid of being overheard. There, Bob pointed toward the conflagration. How do you know where I live? Emma said. Stalker, Steve whispered again. It's a small town, Bob answered, his voice rising in defense. I know where lots of people live. Lots of girls from school. So? Bob said. It's weird, Knob. You're weird. Yeah, well, you're stupid and I can act normal. What? Steve scoffed. That doesn't even make sense. You don't make sense, Bob glared then faltered. Hey, Emma? Steve glanced around and saw Emma sneaking up the road. She was a half block away, moving while the boys argued. The rest of the scouts trailed after her, a silent line of creeping ducks in a row. Come on, Steve said as he jogged after her. Chapter 6. Are you seeing this? Bob breathed. We've got eyes, Knob, Steve snapped. What happened? Emma asked. What's going on? Two military troop transports blocked the road, nose to nose in a V pattern, or an arrow pointing back the way the group of kids had just came. The windows were starred and cracked, all 6 tires on each truck flat. Are those bullet holes? Steve pointed to the black dots against the green paint, like leopard spots on a chameleon. Shit, Bob said. You can say that again. Bob took a breath to repeat it. Don't, Emma advised. The group shuffled forward as one, staying close together. Shell casings, Bob said as his feet kicked spent cartridges on the asphalt. The streetlights around them flickered out, then back on again, casting the intersection in a weak glow. We're losing power, said Bob. As if to answer him, more lights went out, plunging the world around them into darkness. Their intersection was an island in the darkness. Let's just go, said Emma. She led them between the noses of the trucks at the point of the V and crept between the vehicles. Bob glanced at the driver's door as he passed and hopped up on the running board. Knob, get down, Steve hissed. The curly-haired boy glared over his shoulder. I'm checking on what they left, he hissed back. A fog-eyed soldier slammed his face into the closed window, teeth snapping as he growled. Oh shit, Bob shrieked as he flinched and fell. Steve half caught him before he landed on his head, and yanked him upright. Quiet, Steve warned him. They're attracted to noise. But it was too late. They could hear the moans and shuffling walk of more coming toward them. Long shadows flickered in firelight as they stretched across the street, bouncing toward the military checkpoint. Great job, Knob, Steve said under his breath. Come on. He grabbed Emma by the hand and yanked her into a run away from the intersection. Bob and the scouts raced to keep up. Steve led them in a straight line for 2 blocks, then spied a 24-hour convenience store with bars on the windows, and a neon open sign flickering to the left of the entrance. Steve tried the door and it opened. In here, he said and pulled Emma after him. Bob and the scouts followed. They chased after Emma and Steve, who reached the back row of 4 aisles and ducked between the pork rinds and the beer cooler. Is this safe? Emma tried to catch her breath. Hey! Get out! Mr. Patel, the owner behind the counter, screamed at them. You kids, get out of my store. Quiet, Steve hissed. Don't you know what's going on out there? Shut up. Shut up. Patel screamed. Shut up. You are in my store. You shut up. Please, be quiet, Emma begged. Mr. Patel marched from behind the counter and glared at them. You get out. Now. He marched to the front door and slammed it open. Get out, or I'm calling the police. A policeman grabbed the store owner by his shirt and took a bite out of his scalp. Mr. Patel shrieked as another zombie joined the Z in blue and rode the writhing man to the ground, ripping and tearing chunks out of him. Poor zombie, Bob whispered. Poor zombie, Steve hissed. What the hell are you talking about? Bob gave him a serious look. They eat brains, he tapped his head. It's going to starve with that guy. Steve shook his head. We need to move. His head swiveled as he searched and paused as he spied a narrow doorway leading to a storeroom. Back door, he said and sneaked across the open space between the end of the row and the doorway. Emma went next, then Bob and the scouts one by one. Chapter 7. There was a definite line that delineated between the sad side of town and the good side. In the past they would refer to the sad side as the other side of the tracks. A place for poor people. The place for people down on their luck. Or for people who weren't born lucky. The high school was located on the other side of that sad line. It had the downtown too, despite the best efforts of a town council bent on rehabilitation and gentrification. They could tell when they reached the demarcation. The sidewalks looked new. The bricks looked fresh and clean on the buildings. The streets were white of the concrete and the gutters still white. That's where Emma lived. In a cul-de-sac at the end of a street. They walked the sad line for a few minutes as if they were afraid to cross over. Afraid of what they would find. The nice side of town was dark too. Just as dark as the sad side. There were sporadic street lights casting down yellow cones, small pockets of electric hope that made those spaces look normal. Sane. Behind them there was noise. Inarticulate screams, moans and yells. They sounded out of place and unreal. Bob stopped on the side of the street. What? Steve asked. Bob pointed as an answer. A pattern of dark on dark moved in front of them, like black storm clouds rolling across a night sky. Indistinct, which made it worse because the mind abhors a vacuum. It fills in the missing details. The lizard brain takes over and assumes the worst. And on this night, the brain had no frame of reference. Saber-toothed tigers and grizzly bears were way easier to fathom. The Walking Dead were not. The shadows kept moving forward, dark patches on the dark night, growing and twisting in menace. Steve pulled Emma behind him and prepared to fight. "Who the hell let you losers out?" The voice was high-pitched, on the verge of cracking. Flashlights popped on, scattering the darkness, pushing it back to reveal a group of boys. "Byron? Bob?" The thin, scrawny boy with the high-pitched voice squeaked. Bob pushed past Steve and exchanged awkward, clumsy high-fives with Byron and the others. "Welcome to the end of the world," Byron crowed. He brandished a wooden sword. "LARPing?" Bob asked. "You weren't there," Byron gushed. "You should have seen it. We were behind the school." "You were at the school?" Emma interrupted. "Yeah," Byron looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "We saw you, but you were running the other way." "Mr. Matthews," she started to explain. "Yeah, we found him," Byron waved her off. "Or he found us. Either way," he held up the sword again to reveal a dark stain running the length of it. "We took care of it." "It?" "Him," Byron grinned. "He was one of them." "One of what?" Steve asked. "It's some kind of chemical leak, right? Something making people act this way." "Is your head always this far up your ass?" Brian scoffed. His bravery earned him a few chuckles from the group of cardboard armor-clad kids behind him. "I can still beat your ass," Steve lunged forward. "Tyler." Byron dodged to one side. A young boy with a handsome face and long bangs lifted a rifle that looked too big for him to his shoulder and aimed at Steve. "If he does that again, shoot him." Steve held up both hands and took a step back. "Come on, Byron," said Emma. "We went to Tyler's house to get his gun," said Byron. "His dad taught him how to shoot. It's way more effective than our toy swords." "No one needs to shoot anyone," said Steve. "Not each other," Byron waved at Tyler. The tiny boy lowered the rifle. "Not yet, anyway." "Where are you going?" "Home," said Emma. "Why?" "It's a new world," Byron said. He turned excited eyes toward Bob. "I'm doing it. I'm building the kingdom." "Now?" "We're going to the prep academy," said Brian. "We can stay safe there." "But someone will stop this," said Emma. "You're kidding, right?" "Tell me she's kidding." "Someone, please explain to the journalist that the government is gone. The army is gone. The police are gone. Or one of them," he pointed in a vague direction toward the fires and screams. "Or all of them. Come with us, Bob." Bob glanced over his shoulder at Emma. "I can't," he said. "But they can." He nodded toward his scout buddies. Byron looked at the tired and scared group and shrugged. "May," he said. "Try to keep up." He held out a hand to shake Bob's. "When you're done, you know where to find us." He pumped twice, then marched down the street at the head of a column of boys. It wasn't much of an army, not yet, but they were packed in tight and moved in unison. "Watch out for him, Bob," Byron yelled back through the darkness. Bob almost asked who. "Nice friends, Knob." "How would you know?" "You can go with them, Knob," said Steve. "I can handle this." Emma corrected. "We can handle this." Bob's eyes traveled from her face to his and back again. "I don't trust you with her." Steve watched the portly face for a moment, framed by a wild mane of thick curls. He looked earnest. Concerned. "She's safe with me, Knob." Bob licked his lips. "Yeah, well, I'm still going to take her home." Steve groaned and shot a look at Emma. She shrugged. "Then let's get moving," said Steve. "We've got to keep moving." Chapter 8. "Don't move," a voice growled in the darkness. Emma, Steve and Bob froze as a small flame flickered in the darkness. It threw harsh shadows on a familiar bearded face cracked in a mad grin. "This night just keeps getting better," the camo-wearing man stepped out from the sidewalk and faced the trio in the middle of the street. Steve hefted his lacrosse stick. "For us, maybe. But your luck just ran out." "Did it?" The man grinned even wider. if that was possible. They heard the footsteps before they saw them. Then flashlights flicked on, one by one in the hands of 9 men. Emma would have called them of a type. The type that belonged in jail. And that's where some of them came from, judging by the orange scrub tops 4 of them wore, the word county spray painted in small block letters across the back. "Just leave us alone," Bob said. "Anyone want the fat kid?" The bearded man snorted. One of the inmates stepped forward. "The girl is mine though." "Kid for what?" Bob said. "What does he want the kid for?" Steve hefted the stick and slapped it in the palm of his hand. "He wants you to be his girlfriend, knob." "But I've got a girlfriend," Bob stammered. He cast a glance at Emma. "I mean had. We're not together anymore, so I'm free, you know." "Not now, Bob," Emma said. She kept one hand on Steve's jacket, as the group tightened around them. "Things are about to get bad," Steve said over his shoulder. "Brother," said the man in camo. "You have no idea." A giant jacked-up pickup truck roared around the corner of the street, 3 rows of lights on the front blinding everyone. Steve grabbed Emma and Bob and yanked them out of the way as the truck laid on the horn and plowed through the group of men. Shattered bodies flipped and plopped on the asphalt as the truck roared into them. Bob sat up first from where Steve had knocked them. "Oh shit," he said. Emma scrambled up. "We need to keep moving." The bearded man loomed behind her and snatched her off her feet. Bob screamed as they crashed to the ground in a tumble of groans and scuffs. Emma tried to scream, but the weight on top of her was too much. It came out as a moaning groan. Steve jumped up, hands empty. "Get off her," he yelled and started toward the 2 writhing bodies on the ground. The camo man sat on top of Emma's hips, and pulled a gun from the back of his pants. He pointed it at Steve. "Not so much without your stick, huh?" He cocked the hammer back on the 6-shot snub nose and tilted his head to aim at Steve. Emma slammed 2 bunched fists into the man's stomach. The blow sent his aim wide, the loud explosion cracking the night. Steve took 2 steps forward and punted the camo man's chin with the tip of his foot. His head snapped back, his body stiff like all the circuits had been shut down. Like the lights were off and no one was home. He fell like a tree, rigid limbs locked tight. "I played soccer too," Steve spit. Emma shoved his leg off of her and pulled herself next to Steve and Bob. "Damn Newton," Bob sighed. Emma dropped to her knees. "Are you okay?" Steve tried to help her up. She shrugged his hand away as her hand searched the ground. Emma came up with the small black revolver and aimed it at the man unconscious on the ground. "Emma," Bob's voice was low, questioning. She aimed the pistol at the man in front of her, his still form a dark splotch on the dark ground. She held it for a moment, then a moment longer. The tip of the barrel wavered as she wrestled with the decision. It was a night of firsts. First being saved, first needing to be saved, first zombie apocalypse, first mass disaster, and now, this. A man attacked her. He overpowered her. Hurt her. And she could pay him back. She could get revenge. The gun shivered in her hands. Or maybe that was her. He didn't deserve to live. Emma lowered the gun. But she wasn't going to be the one to kill him. That was a first she was going to put off as long as she could. Until she found out more. Found out what was going on. "I want to go home," she said. Steve took the pistol from her hands and slipped it into the back of his waistband. "Hang on." Bob and Emma watched as he grabbed the unconscious man's leg and dragged him across the grass. "What are you doing?" Bob whispered. Steve pulled the man's right leg off the curb and rested his ankle on the black asphalt on the street. He adjusted it so the knee was still on the curb, and 6 inches of gutter underneath his lower leg. Then Steve stood up and stomped it. Bone cracked, the pain sharp enough that Camo Beard sat up screaming. His hands went to his shattered leg as he rocked back and forth on the grass. "What did you do that for?" Bob asked as Steve rejoined them. "Them," Steve pointed. The street behind them was filled with lumbering bodies, shuffling in their direction. They couldn't make out details at this distance. The island of light they were in shone like a beacon. Steve grabbed Emma by the hand and motioned Bob to follow him. Then the trio began moving in the opposite direction from the horde. They listened to the man's screams grow fainter as they put a block between them. Then they rose in a crescendo before disappearing altogether. Chapter 9. "They won't stop," Steve gasped. He drew the other two up short at a street corner. Bob bent over, elbows on his knees as he tried to breathe. Steve reached over and pulled him upright by his collar. Easier if you stand, knob. Bob huffed, thanks, and stared at Emma as she studied her dark cul-de-sac. They'll trap us inside. Steve studied the relentless horde as the moaning grew louder. Is that Camo Beard? Bob pointed. A face flashed in and out of an errant band of light bouncing from a streetlight off the window of a car. Then it was gone, lost in the crowd and the darkness. We need more than this. Steve pulled out the pistol. Whoa, said Bob. Watch where you point that thing. Steve looked at it in his hand. I've never shot a gun before, he said, almost to himself. I have. Bob held out his palm. How do you know how to shoot a gun? Scouts, Bob grinned. What the hell are they teaching you kids? Steve placed the body of the gun in Bob's hand. The curly-haired kid flicked it open and stared at the cylinders. Only 2 bullets, he announced. He lined up the bullets and flicked it closed. We're gonna need a bigger boat, he said. Steve glanced around. There were 8 houses in the cul-de-sac and 3 yards were spotted with kids' toys. A plastic fort. A disc swing from a low-hanging branch. He scooted through the yard and picked up a baseball bat with a leather glove on the end of the handle. Go, he snapped at Emma. We'll hold them off. They'll trap me in there, she pointed. She was right. The horde would pour into the cul-de-sac and block the road. Go out the back, said Bob. I'll try, she said. You can get away, said Steve. I'll stop them. We'll stop them, said Bob. Get her home. You can't hold them by yourself, Bob said with only a small quiver in his voice. Both of you. This is stupid, said Emma. Go, Steve told them. Go. Bob pushed her toward her home. She took a last look over her shoulder and ran down the street. Bob and Steve lined up and prepared to face the advancing horde. I think that's Mr. Phillips, Bob said. Who? My science teacher. Oh, Steve answered. I skipped science. All of it? That explains a lot. Is that all you got? Give me time to think of something better, said Bob. I meant the gun. Bob looked at the pistol in his hand. The distance between the horde and the 2 boys standing against it shrank to 10 meters. Bob ran to the tree, yanked on the disc swing. Bob, Steve yelled. The first few zombies reached him and he went to work with the bat. He swung left. He swung right. He cracked skulls with the forward motion, knocked heads with the backswing. But there were so many. Too many. They surrounded him, bloody hands reaching for him. A zombie grabbed his shoulders and he couldn't swing the bat. Its head lopped sideways as the hard plastic disc bounced off it like a mace. Steve pulled free and backed up to stand near Bob. He couldn't stand next to the boy with curly hair and cheeky grin as he spun the disc around on the end of the rope and cracked it into the horde. This way, Steve yelled and ran to draw the group after them. Wait, Bob yelled as he hurried after. Chapter 10. Hello? Emma opened the door and stepped into the dark house. She had walked through the hallway from her room to the kitchen hundreds of times in the dark, but this time, it seemed different. Complete and absolute. She shuddered and left the front door open. That was it, she thought. Normally, light from the outside came in through the windows, covering everything in a soft white glow. It was easy to make out the lines in that kind of light, the outline of things, if not the details. But with the streets pitch black, no light leaked in to show her the way. She put a hand out in front of her as she stepped, then pulled it back. Afraid of what she might touch. Or who. Hello? She called out again. She reached the opening to the kitchen and felt her way to the cabinets by hand. She used her sense of touch to find the utility drawer, third from the top, second on the left, and opened it. Yes, she hissed a small victory cry as her hands closed over the tube of a flashlight. She picked it up and clicked it on. A weak flicker of light whimpered in the bulb, then faded. Enough light to make her lose her night sight. Enough to know just how complete the darkness was when it returned. Enough to make a lump form in her throat as the inevitability of it weighed on her. Damn it, she sobbed. Her hand fell in the drawer and she felt the rough plastic edges of a package. A package of blister-sealed batteries. Her dad would have put them there. He was that kind of guy. Buy new batteries and put them beside the flashlight instead of changing them out fresh. Because there still might be life inside the old ones. Emma dropped to her knees and set the flashlight on the floor. She ripped and tore at the plastic edge of the package, but it was designed to withstand the end of the world and small nuclear explosions. The vacuum-sealed thick plastic refused to budge. She yanked and tore, ripped and gnawed, but the package stayed whole. She was about to give up and drew her arm back to toss the batteries across the room when she remembered. Her dad hated those packages. Hated the battery makers who sealed them tighter than jewelry stores sealed diamonds. He had often wondered aloud at the necessity of it, as if air robbed a battery of its charge, and Emma vowed to research it. But the man who put the package beside the flashlight instead of in it because he hated to open it also had backup plan. Razor-sharp utility scissors. They would be beside the package in the drawer. She dropped her hand and felt around, pricked her finger on the tip of the blade. She squealed again in victory, a half giggle, half sob. It took a second to clip open the package and another few seconds to load the tube. Emma dropped the dead batteries in the drawer just so she wouldn't slip on them in the darkness. Then she flicked on the flashlight. The beam was a supernova bouncing off the glass doors of the kitchen cabinets, blinding in its brilliance. She winced and waited for her eyes to adjust. Then she wished she hadn't. The back door was open. The walls of the kitchen were smeared with blood. The floor had a long crusty trail of it leading outside. Emma backed away, one hand to her mouth to hold in a scream, the other gripping the flashlight so tight, it shook and wavered. The beam danced out of the door and she could see the trail of blood and gore as it disappeared into the grass of the backyard. "Mom? Dad?" She called out, praying no one answered. They didn't. Emma took a step toward the door, listening intently. She reached the frame and peeked around. The backyard was empty. The side gate swung on the hinges, open. There was no one there. No sign of her parents. No sign of anything. She turned back to the house. It felt empty too, but she had to check. Emma wandered from her parents' room to her room, to the bathroom and study. Everything looked normal. Until she got to the living room. It was connected to the kitchen in one big open space. The walls were splattered with blood. The floor a mess of unidentifiable stains that looked black in the light from her hand. Something happened here. Something bad, and nasty, and she finally couldn't hold it back anymore. The tears came first, hot and full, dripping down her cheeks as she opened her mouth. She couldn't breathe, couldn't talk, just opened her mouth to let out the pain as a lump in her chest grew. It clogged her throat, clogged her mind. Emma fell to her knees, one hand on the floor as she struggled not to lose it. Not completely. Her folks were gone. She didn't know where. The town was under attack. She didn't know how. Or why. Or even what. Some fictional characters come to life. Something from the movies made real? There were too many questions. Too much unknown. Byron had been right. The police were gone. One had told her to go home, and here she was, but nothing was there. The military was gone. They found the empty trucks. There was no one there to protect her. To keep her safe. No one in charge. Her air came back in one giant gulp and she moaned. An answering moan came from the front door. Emma glanced up and aimed her flashlight at the open front door. Bodies moved across the yard, shuffling steps drawn by the sound she made. She fumbled up to her feet and caught sight of Bob and Steve, fighting back to back on the other side of the cul-de-sac. She had been wrong. There were two people there to protect her. Two people trying to keep her safe. They just needed someone to take charge. Emma backed toward the garage door where it led into the kitchen. Her mom had a habit of putting keys on a hook when she stepped inside, just so she wouldn't misplace and lose them. And there they were, dangling by the door. Emma sniffed again. Another sign that Mom had been home. That the blood belonged to one of them. Mom and Dad. She heard a body thud off the front door frame, grabbed the car keys and slipped into the garage, the beam of the flashlight leading the way. Chapter 11. This is it, Bob. Steve hefted the bat over his shoulder. The mob of zombies drew closer, moans growing louder. His voice was almost lost in the noise of theirs and the shuffle of their feet. It's an honor to die with you, Bob whispered. Today is a good day to die, Knob. Now he breaks out the Klingon. Bob didn't think it was appropriate to smile, what with death approaching, but felt one creep across his cheeks anyway. What the hell's a Klingon? Then the first of the Z was 3 feet away. Steve lifted the bat, Bob lifted a garden rake. They screamed in fury, in fear, and in grief for lives about to be cut short. They shouted in loss and anger, and to share courage, for surely that's what this sacrifice must be. A shrill horn cut off their battle cry. An SUV plowed into the row of Z, sent bodies and pieces flying. Emma leaned out of the open driver's window and shouted, "Get in!" Bob and Steve scrambled into the back seat as the second wave of Z began beating on the far side of the long SUV. The Z poured around the front and rear bumpers, purpled hands reaching, grasping. "Go," Bob bellowed. "Go," Steve added. "That's what I said." Bob fell backwards into the third row seat as Emma punched the gas. The giant vehicle bounced over the Walking Dead with a surge of wet pops and splotches. Steve recovered first and crawled into the passenger seat. "Do you want me to drive?" "I can drive." Emma slammed through another group of zombies. I know, he said as he buckled up. "You just seem upset." "Of course, I'm upset. My parents are gone." "You shouldn't drive when you're upset," said Bob. He settled into the seat behind Steve and fumbled with the seat belt to strap in. "That's what I said," Steve agreed. "We agree on something?" "Shit," said Bob. "It is the end of the world." He didn't say it. Emma gripped the wheel. "You didn't say it." She glared at Steve. "Watch the road." Steve and Bob shouted together. Emma jumped and turned her glare to watch the road. "Where are we going?" Bob asked. Emma turned onto a small road that led out of town. "Away," she said. "We have to get away." "To where?" "I don't know," she sobbed. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes and dribbled down her cheeks. Steve reached up and put his hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said. "None of us know." "Yeah," said Bob. He leaned forward and put his hand on her shoulder too, closer to her neck so he could be above the other hand there. Steve snorted and shook his head. Bob nudged his hand away. Steve fought back, their fingers flicking and fumbling in a gross parody of a thumb war gone to hell. "Stop it," Emma raised her voice. The two boys settled back into their respective seats and seethed. "This is serious," she reminded them. "We know," said Bob. The lights of the SUV played over a goodbye sign on the edge of town. Emma pulled over to the shoulder on the side of the road just past it. "You are now leaving Delano, Steve Reed." "Actually, we just left," said Bob. "The town line is back there." He turned in his seat and pointed at an invisible marker on a map the sign indicated. "No one likes a now at all, knob," Steve sighed. "Guys." "He's right, Bob." Emma rubbed her hands across her face as if trying to wipe away the shock and fatigue. Okay, I get it," said Bob. "But guys. Zombies." They both turned around to look where he was pointing. Shadowy figures lurched in their direction under the harsh yellow glow of street lights. "We need to go," said Steve. Emma dropped the truck into drive and pulled out onto the road. "What about your parents?" asked Bob. "If they got away," she clutched the wheel, her eyes welling up with tears again. "If they got away, they would go to my grandma's house." Over the hill and through the woods, Steve shivered. He stared out of the passenger side window at the tight-knit pine forest that surrounded them. "There are bad things in the woods." "Those are fairy tales," Emma whispered. "Actually," said Bob. "The fairy tales were told so that people." "Bob!" Emma and Steve shouted together. "Sorry," said Bob in a sheepish voice. "Habit." He held his tongue as the trio drove off in the darkness and the safety of Emma's grandparents' home. End. The adventure continues in Battlefield Z, Silent Run. Can I send you Flyover Zombie for free? Join the adventure in Battlefield Z while you wait. A father leads a ragtag group of survivors on a hunt for his lost children in a zombie-filled wasteland. Battlefield Z series. Grab your copy of the sci-fi comedy about a dad hunting for his kids in a post-apocalyptic wasteland where zombies aren't the worst thing to survive. Battlefield Z. Children's Brigade. Sweet Home Zombie. Zombie Blues Highway. Mardi Gras Zombie. Bluegrass Zombie. Outcast Zombie. Renegade Zombie. Everglades Zombie. Flyover Zombie, the Battlefield Z series. Headshots, the Battlefield Z series. Overland Zombie. Lone Star Zombie. The Pass Zombie. Dust Devil Zombie. Terminal Zombie. Ronin Zombie. Gone Dark. Silent Run. No entry. Restricted.